When they say High Middle Ages, they mean high. Did Dante go to hell and back just for a good story? How did the Crusaders manage to lose Jerusalem? Why is this era the apogee of the medieval papacy? And what are the commercial, intellectual, and papal revolutions of this era? These and other questions will be answered right after this. I'm Professor Jerome Arkenberg, and I've been teaching a wide variety of history courses at colleges across this country for the past 30 years. In this video, I'm going to tell you all about how today's Europe first took shape, how Europe took off both commercially and intellectually, what happened to the Crusades, and how the Papal Revolution brought the medieval church to its apogee. At the end, I'll have the wrap-up quote of this video. But first, make sure to click like, share, and subscribe, and that little bell thingy, so I can continue to bring you more great videos just like this one. With the end of the barbarian invasions, from the mid-11th century, Europe's population began to grow, in conjunction with a commercial revolution. The Italians invented double-entry bookkeeping, the bill of exchange, and limited liability. Moneylenders turned into bankers, and a market economy arose in Flanders, Lombard, and England. From the 10th century onwards, to protect themselves from Muslim piracy, the Italian city-states, shown here, of Venice, Genoa, Pisa, Amalfi, Ancona, and Ragusa, built large fleets of warships, enabling them to seize control of the Mediterranean trade routes from the Muslims. After the fall of Jerusalem in 1099, the Crusaders themselves came to rely on these city-states for transport, in return for which the Italians received land and cash, setting up gated areas within a city with their own governor appointed from home, and legal, financial, and customs privileges, such as those they received from the Byzantines at Pera and Galata across the Golden Horn from Constantinople. From the 11th to the 15th centuries, these city-states held a monopoly on trade with the Levant, that is, Syria and Palestine, based on silk, spice, incense, herbs, and opium. Yes, opium. And with North Africa, based on gold and slaves, bringing untold wealth when Italian merchants distributed and sold these items and commodities across Europe. Amalfi, down here, right by what is pretty much present-day Naples, was a pioneer in this, trading grain, salt, timber, and slaves to Egypt, in return for gold, with which they used to buy silk in Constantinople for sale back in Italy. Unfortunately for Amalfi, in 1135, the town was sacked by Pisa and rapidly declined. Pisa, in turn, in 1016, in alliance with Genoa, defeated Muslim pirates and took control of Corsica and the Tyrrhenian Sea, and the Balearic Islands in 1115, and came to be at its height in the 12th to 13th centuries until defeated by the Genoese at the Battle of Meloria, after which it lost Corsica and Sardinia to Genoa, and by 1409 had been conquered itself by the city-state of Florence. Genoa, their trade benefited in the east with the Crusades, and the west in alliance with Pisa. In 1261, Genoa helped to re-establish the Byzantine Empire, return for which it was able to take over Venice's trade routes to the Black Sea, and then after 1284, Pisa's western routes, as seen here. Ragusa in Dalmatia emerged as a power in the 11th century, but fell under Venetian control from 1204 to 1358, at which point it was able to regain its freedom by an alliance with Hungary. Speaking of Venice, it began by defeating Muslim pirates and then expanding in the 11th century, reaching down through the Adriatic Sea, dominating the east commercially and militarily with its fleet, conquering not just Ragusa, but Corfu, Naxos, Crete, eventually Cyprus itself, and the Isle of Euboea, and various other islands, and by the 15th century, it was the richest state in all of Europe. Meanwhile, at the same time, merchants in Northern Europe, those who wished greater trading access and protection from the rapations of tolls and nobles, formed an association to do just that, the Hanse, which by 1300 had become the economic power in the north. Combining their economic forces, the Hanse coerced authorities across the north to grant them trade privileges, such as reduced tolls and duties, immunity from foreign criminal laws, weighing privileges, and other benefits. And so by 1350, the Hanse had evolved into an association not of individual merchants, as it started, but of cities, the Hanseatic League, which, while not a confederation, nonetheless gave all citizens of its member cities special trade benefits. You didn't have to be an actual merchant. The Hanse made its wealth off the flow of fur, herring, beeswax, timber, grain, metal, pitch, honey, amber, salt, and Flemish cloth across a great northern trade route from Novgorod in what's now Russia to London, with branches running into the interior of Poland, Scandinavia, Germany, Russia, and even south all the way to Byzantium, especially enriching along the way the cities of Lübeck, Hamburg, Bremen, Cologne, and Bruges. As a result of the activities of the Italians in the south, the Hanse in the north, and the increase in trade across Europe, the latter's urban population began to grow, such that in Flanders and Lombardy, for the first time since the collapse of the Roman Empire, urban culture once again dominated European civilization, unlike castles and manor houses in the countryside. You see this here. This great wave of building took place in the large growing population estimates. As I said, a great building boom followed, fueled by rising wealth and demand from a growing population. At the same time, a church reform movement began at the Abbey of Cluny, aiming to free the church from increasing lay interference and control over its landed wealth, its patronage jobs, and its mission, salvation, which involves centralizing the church under the Pope, putting bishops, priests, and regular clergy, that is, the monasteries, under the Pope's control, and prohibiting simony, nepotism, and clerical marriage. And this began the Papal Revolution, or as some would call it in Germany, the Investiture controversy. 1073, a monk of Cluny, Hildebrand by name, was elected pope as Gregory VII, and he immediately ordered the Holy Roman Emperor, Henry IV, to defend himself on charges that he refused to recognize papal supremacy over the Church, the Empire, and all mankind. An infuriated Henry IV, who needed the clergy to be his unpaid bureaucrats, and also everyone thought, the reason he's the emperor is because God put him in his place, he had his German bishops depose Gregory VII as pope. Previous popes had been deposed by Holy Roman emperors. Why? Because they weren't particularly holy. Not the emperors, the popes. The bishops supported Henry because to accede to Greg's demands would mean they losing their own independence. So as a result, civil war ensued. Nobility and clergy split between emperor and pope, as all sought to gain as much power as possible. The pope raised the nobility against Henry because in Germany he was centralizing and trying to take away their power. Meanwhile, of course, the pope was doing the same to the bishops of Germany, who then turned to Henry as their savior. Now, though Gregory VII died in exile, his papal successors continued the struggle, building power through the Crusades, while setting up an extensive legal system and bureaucracy based on a combination of Roman and church law. It also stopped any chance of Germany becoming a unified state until the end of the Franco-Prussian War, 1871, at which point Germany was totally infused with nationalism, which contributed mightily to the outbreak of World War I, which you can learn more about in my video on La Belle Époque. Spurred by the finding of a copy of Justinian's Digest of Roman Law in Bologna in 1060, and his exposition of classical Aristotelian logic, which had long been forgotten in the West, in place of a highly simplistic logic, an intellectual revolution took place simultaneously. Now you can learn more about the discovery of the Digest and Roman legal education in my video on legal education. As part of this, from the 12th century, lay literacy was increasingly common, even among serfs. So that by the end of the Middle Ages, especially in northern Italy, Lombardy, England, and Flanders, at least half the population could read their own language, even if they could not write it. It sounds strange, but reading and writing were not taught together. Writing was more calligraphy. So you were taught how to read, but not how to write. You can learn more about that in my video on medieval education. This was connected with the rise of a class of landowners, merchants, and estate managers who needed to keep accounts, pay taxes, read contracts, and litigate lawsuits, along with the rise of mysticism and personal piety. And of course, the piety and mysticism we'll talk more about in the lecture on mysticism and heresy. But anyway, by the 16th century, Europe contained most of the literate people in the world. At the same time, kings and princes began to establish bureaucracies to run their states by written rules and laws, which of course accelerated the drive to centralize states. You can learn more about that in yet another video all about medieval bureaucracy. The immediate struggle between popes and emperors ran on for another 50 years, until the Concordat of Worms in 1122 brought peace between the two and largely ratified the papal position. Now, I hadn't really talked about the papal position, why this is so important. In the Eastern Roman Empire, Byzantium, the emperors were in control of the church, which meant they were actually in control of the church doctrine. The entire purpose of the church is to ensure that its parishioners, its flock, in fact, the entire world, achieve salvation by going through the door to heaven and not the incorrect door to hell. And if an emperor comes by, or a king, or a duke, or any lay person, any non-clergy, and tells the people for their own personal benefit or their misunderstanding of church doctrine, which at times is quite complex. You can learn more about that again in yet another video on medieval faith and reason. But they can easily lure, wittingly or unwittingly, people through the wrong door, the door to hell, thus defeating the church's entire purpose. How to avoid that? Make sure the church is not controlled by any lay person, but by trained theologians and priests and administrators who actually, presumably, know which is the door to heaven and how to go through it. The papacy reached the height of its medieval power with this guy, Innocent III, who actually was not that innocent, but that's another story, who reigned as pope from 1198 to 1216. During his time as pope, King John of England was forced to become the pope's vassal. The Holy Roman Empire was under de facto papal control, and the papal court turned into a combined, in modern terms, United Nations and World Court, at least for Europe. Meanwhile, back east, after the disastrous Second Crusade in 1187, which had aimed to take Damascus and failed, the king of Jerusalem, Guy of Lusignan, was defeated at the Battle of Hattin by the Fatimid Sultan of Egypt, Saladin, leading to the loss of all but Tyre and sparking the Third Crusade, led by Richard the Lionheart of England, Philip Augustus of France, and the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa. As we see here, the Battle of Hattin, and here we are, Philip Augustus getting ready to go off on crusade. Unfortunately, poor Fred Barbarossa drowned crossing a river in Anatolia. Still, the Crusaders took Acre, which is a main port, pretty much near modern-day Haifa and Tel Aviv, a deadly 2-year siege, but were unable to move inland and take Jerusalem. However, they did manage to take control of all the key ports of Acre, Jaffa, Tyre, Sidon, Beirut, Ascalon, and Tripoli along the coast. Then, in 1204, Pope Innocent III organized the Fourth Crusade to regain Jerusalem. But the Crusaders, on their own, attacked not the Holy Land, but Constantinople and the Byzantine Empire. Why? The Venetians, who were transporting them, agreed to wipe out the Crusaders' debts in return for the Crusaders taking out the Venetians' main commercial rival in the east, the Byzantines. This was a blow from which the Byzantines never recovered. The Crusaders set up their own Latin Empire, with the Catholic emperor ruling in Constantinople, while a few Byzantine families fled to the provinces, setting up empires in Trebizond, you see here, Nicaea, the Despotate of Epirus. But Besides the Latin emperors, you also had the Duke of Athens, the Duke of the Archipelago, and the Prince of Achaia. And of course, the green ones are those controlled by Venice. In 1230, Emperor Frederick II, called Stupor Mundi, not Stupid Monday, but Stupor Monday, wonder of the world, Fred II, got by charm and diplomacy what the last four crusades had failed to do by force. He was able to regain Jerusalem, along with Nazareth and Bethlehem. Fred knew Arabic fluently, knew all the customs, and the Sultan at the time loved him, said, sure, I mean, pilgrims were allowed to come anyway, so just let us have a few things. But in 1244, when a new sultan took power, all these gains were lost. 1261, the Paleologi family, the emperors of Nicaea, which would be the one back here, right back here, managed to retake Constantinople with the help of the Genoese and reestablish the empire, which of course is why the Genoese got whatever privileges the Venetians used to have. However, Crete and Euboea, which is this island right here, remained under the control of Venice, Trebizond off this way, and Epirus, which is the despot of Epirus, remained independent, and central Greece and the Peloponnesus stayed under the control of Western Crusaders. The Byzantines did, however, manage to control Sparta, which time was so desperately poor nobody really wanted it. Sad. Crusader zeal in the West, meanwhile, had turned elsewhere, in part to Iberia, especially after a Muslim resurgence in the 12th century, leading to a decisive defeat of the Muslims, the Battle of Las Navas de Tolosas, right down here. In 1212, the fall of first Cordoba in 1236, and then Seville in 1248, leaving only the enclave of Granada as a Muslim state in the south. Other crusades were directed against the pagan Balts, Latvians, Prussians, and Lithuanians. And these Prussians are not the later Prussians who were German. They're actually a Baltic-speaking people, akin to the Latvians and Lithuanians. And the German Teutonic Knights were able to convert the land called Prussia by genocide. Something about Germans and genocide, I don't understand that. First Charlemagne with the Saxons, and now the Prussians, later Hitler and the Jews. Anyway, wiping out the Prussians completely, nearly destroying the Latvians up here, and forcing the Lithuanians, up here, to form this vast state, controlling Belarus all the way down to Kiev and the Ukraine in the mid-13th century. Though they had to combine with the Polish kingdom, Jagiello, the Grand Duke of Lithuania, who reigned from 1386 to 1434, accepted baptism as a Catholic, united his kingdom with Poland. More on that later. So, in 1291, shorn of Byzantine and further Crusader support, the Kingdom of Jerusalem, having lost one port after another along the coast, lost Acre itself to the Mamluk Sultan of Egypt, Khalil, who then had the town's entire population slaughtered. At the same time, the decline of the medieval papacy and the High Middle Ages began with the papacy of Boniface VIII, who reigned from 1294 to 1303, which, however, is another story. And here's today's wrap-up quote. "Will no one rid me of this troublesome priest?" King Henry II of England. So, Let me know what you think of this quote in the comments below. Also, what you liked about the video and what other historical topics or subjects you'd like to see in future videos. Be sure to click like, share, and subscribe, as it will help me bring you more great videos on the Middle Ages. And click on that little bell thingy so you'll know when the next History Awaits for No One video is posted. If you want to know more, there are recommended studies on this topic in the description below, along with other ways to connect with me. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the past.